All right, so there's this myth out there that you need 40% of your calories coming from fat to optimize your testosterone. And I actually wanted to talk about this because I looked in my journal yesterday and I found this entry from a few months ago back in September. It said, I know I need 40% fat for testosterone, so how do I hit that? And I was like calculating all my macros here, trying to figure out how I could hit 40% fat from eating tons of beef, tons of eggs, tons of butter, and dairy. But as it turns out, that actually made me gain weight. That made me have testosterone in the 500s around that time when I was trying to maximize my fat intake with all these animal foods. I actually had low testosterone. So I want to talk about why, in most cases, you really don't need 40% fat for testosterone. Now, the number one reason, or actually, first, before we start, a little disclaimer is that this is for the pro-metabolic diet. We're eating a high-carb, kind of animal-based diet. It's based on the ideas of Ray Peat, but it's a pro-metabolic diet, meaning we're optimizing for thyroid and metabolism, where we're eating tons and tons of carbs. So like I eat 300 grams of carbs a day. And then your protein intake is moderate. Your fat intake is what we're actually going to discuss today. So first things first, you're going to basically, in terms of numbers that I can give you, 20% of your total calories coming from fat is the lower end of the range. So there's basically a range. It's going to be 20 to 40% is where you always, your entire life, you want to be in terms of your percent of fat intake. Now this number right here is only if you are very lean, and we'll talk about why in a second. But this number is where you want to be. You want to lower your fat intake if you are not in the 10 to 12% body fat range. Now, what's interesting is that, testosterone optimizes in this range right here. So 10 to 12% body fat. If you are watching this video and you're sitting down, you can reach around your belly. If you feel like a little bit of chub right around your belly right here, like a roll of fat around your belly, you're not 10 to 12% body fat. So you can lower your fat intake down to 20%. If you're watching this, if you're watching this and you are 10 to 12% body fat, then you can go ahead and just keep eating a bunch of fat at 40% of your total calories. You can click off this video. Just don't listen to anything else. But most of you are not at 10 to 12% body fat. And even if you are 10 to 12% body fat, there's definitely some things you can learn here. So this was me around the time actually when I was writing in this journal, when I was saying, I need 40% fat for testosterone. Now, if you look at me, I mean, I look decent, right? I'm pretty muscular. I've always been, lifting and everything. So I'm pretty large, but a lot of this is fat. A lot of this mass is just fat around my stomach and my arms. Like there's some definition, but I'm like 175 here, which is up 15 pounds from where I, ideally should be at 10 or 12% body fat. So I'm like 15% body fat in this picture, and yet I'm still trying to eat 40% of my calories from fat, which is a huge mistake. The reason this is a huge mistake, and now I'm much leaner than this at this point, I'm still not exactly where I want to be. I don't know if you guys can see, but I have better abs now. Less fat, I'm like 165, so down 10 pounds basically. But I'm still going to try to get down to 160 so I can hit 12% body fat and have, then I'll have a higher fat intake for my total calories. Now, the reason that you want lower fat intake if you are not as lean, if you're chubby, is because your body has plenty of fat to pull from in terms of lipolysis. Okay, your body has this sort of baseline level at all times, whether it doesn't matter, like you shouldn't be fasting or you shouldn't be, cutting carbs or anything, because that'll just basically amplify this baseline lipolysis. Lipolysis just means burning fat, right? So your body burns fat automatically at rest because your muscles need fat, your, heart uses fat. I think different parts of your body use fat as fuel. Now, that's not to say you should go carnivore or, fasting or anything, because that will increase fat burning beyond this baseline level. But what that actually does on top of that is also this boost that you get from carnivore or low carb fasting, whatever, or like tons of exercise, is you basically increase your stress hormones. So your stress hormones, including, cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, those are all going to be elevated if you try to get more fat loss from these quick fat loss, methods like fasting or carnivore. But when you're around, I would say, like anything above 15% body fat, this baseline is going to be a great source of fat for you. You have fat stores to pull from. Okay, so you can get away with making this your primary source of fat for your muscles, for your whatever, parts of your body are burning fat at rest. You just need this baseline right here. You don't need dietary fat as well. If you're adding 40% of your calories from fat on top of that, you're going to basically create an excess of fuel. A lot of people like to say Randall cycle. Oh, you can't eat carbs and fat at the same time. That's not necessarily the case. But you don't want to be eating tons of carbs and tons of fat when you're not lean. When you are lean, then you can eat high carb, high fat. But when you're not, you already have plenty of fat to pull from, and you're not insulin sensitive. So you need to reduce the fat to make yourself more insulin sensitive and drop body fat. When you have less fat, your blood sugar spikes will be quicker, which means your insulin responses will be quicker as well. And that's basically insulin shuttling glucose into your cells, which means your metabolism will be working more efficiently. You'll have blood sugar spikes that look like this instead of like, this if you were eating too much fat, because the fat would slow down the blood sugar spikes. But your insulin signaling is going to be much better if you lower the fat intake, and you already burn some fat at rest, so you don't need excess dietary fat on top of that. It's just, excessive. On top of that, if you replace the fat, now you lower your fat intake, that doesn't mean you replace that fat with protein, because if you eat a ton of protein beyond 0.8 grams of protein per pound of like lean mass, essentially, you're going to basically increase your cortisol, increase your glucagon, because those are going to turn the protein you eat into glucose. But that's not something you want to do. You want to replace the fat with more carbs. It might be surprising. You've always heard, oh, carbs make you fat. All the carnivores, tell you carbs will make you fat. Blood sugar spikes make you fat. What's interesting is that when you replace the fat with more carbs, you actually get a better thyroid, because you're basically putting more gasoline into the car, into the engine of your body, which is your thyroid. And you get fat loss because of your improved metabolism, and you get better testosterone, because carbs, when you have these blood sugar spikes without too much fat, your stress hormones go down, because your insulin is shuttling the fuel into your cells, and you are basically creating ATP very efficiently, and you have very low stress hormones, because your body doesn't need to increase cortisol and glucagon to maintain your blood sugar by breaking down protein or anything like that. You're giving it plenty of carbs for your blood sugar, for your fuel, for your ATP, without any stress hormone increase. And your thyroid will thank you. When your thyroid is running efficiently, you don't store anything as fat, and your testosterone will be significantly higher, because your stress hormones will be low. What's interesting, and you might not believe me, you might say, oh, but fat is saturated fat, so important for testosterone. And yes, it is important. You need a certain level of it. That's why we're not going to like 10% fat. We're going to 20%. But what's interesting is that in this study, this is a study looking at testosterone concentration in, I believe, middle-aged men. Okay, so I think they're somewhat overweight. So if this is you, you're probably somewhat overweight. I was somewhat overweight, and I'm still kind of somewhat overweight. Then this is going to apply to you. So what this graph is looking at is basically what happens when you replace certain fats with different macronutrients. So what's interesting is that they replaced saturated fat, or I guess they're comparing saturated fat versus carbohydrates in this little graph right here. What's interesting is that when they replaced the carbs with saturated fat, the testosterone actually went down. Just a little bit. Like, saturated fat is still beneficial, so it didn't go down a lot. But testosterone actually dropped when they added saturated fat in place of the carbohydrate. The monounsaturated fat actually was a little bit better than the carbs, interestingly. I don't know exactly why that is, but obviously, like, the polyunsaturated fat was worse, obviously, than the saturated fat for testosterone. Trans fats versus the carbohydrates, obviously replacing the carbs with trans fats created a huge drop in testosterone. And the polyunsaturated fat versus the carbs, when they replaced the carbs with polyunsaturated fat, there was also a drop. Not surprising. But what is interesting is that when you look at these right here, they replaced the carbs with saturated fat, and the testosterone actually went down a little bit. So what this basically tells us is that we can replace carbs with fat and still have basically really good testosterone if we're trying to lose body fat. This might not be the case if they looked at lean, young, muscular men, okay? Because then you don't have as many fat stores to pull from, which is when you can increase the fat up to 40%. You don't have as much of a baseline level of lipolysis, okay? Which means you need to have a certain level of dietary fat, because especially if you're muscular. If you're muscular, your muscles actually burn fat at rest, okay? This is very important to understand, because if you have a lot of muscle like me, if you're like me and you are, pretty jacked, like look at my biceps right there. I'm pretty jacked, and all of those muscles are burning fat at rest. You have a bigger sink for the fat if you have more muscle. So if you're lean and you have a lot of muscle, then you need up to 40% of fat, of your calories, from saturated fat. Okay, we're obviously not doing polyunsaturated fat. You saw in the graph here how polyunsaturated fat decreased testosterone. But if you're muscular and you're lean, if you're very lean, I mean 10 to 12% body fat. Be honest with yourself, because you're probably not. You might think, oh, I have abs. I'm 12% body fat. You're probably not. 12% is leaner than you think, and you definitely want to get there to optimize your testosterone. But you can do up to 40% from fat. You can do if you're let's say you're lean but you're not muscular, then you don't need as much fat. You can do 30%. Or if you're almost at 10 to 12% body fat, but you have a lot of muscle, or you're let's say you're like 15% body fat but you have a lot of muscle, then you can maybe increase the fat to 30%. You don't have to stay at 20, because your muscles will burn lots of fat, and it might be more than this baseline level of lipolysis can handle. Okay, so it really depends on your leanness. Okay, your body composition. Once I get to this 10 to 10% number, this 10% body fat number, once I'm shredded, then I increase the fat to 40%. If you are very lean. Other than that, because then I'm going to actually use that fat, and it's not going to be stored as fat. Fat is actually the easiest macronutrient for your liver to store as fat, interestingly enough. So you don't want to be storing it as fat. You want to make sure that you're actually going to use the fat for fuel. So only increase your fat intake to 40% if you are lean, okay? Now, because if I had understood that back when I was... What the fuck is this? What are we doing? Every time I click the eraser. All right, whatever. But if I had understood this back when I was journaling, I was like, oh, I have to hit 40% fat. I didn't actually have to, because I wasn't 10% body fat. I needed to actually lower the fat intake and increase the carbs, and then I lost body fat when I did that. I dropped 10 pounds pretty easily without restricting or feeling bad or anything. My testosterone's still pretty high, so it was in the 500s then, and then it was 700s after a couple months after that, and then now I just got it tested today, actually, and we'll see where it is at. But yeah, your fat intake is definitely one of the biggest levers you can pull. Now, I just wanted to give you a quick rundown of fat loss, okay? If you're like, oh, how the hell am I going to lose body fat? First of all, you increase the carbs and you decrease the fat. Keep the protein, pretty moderate, no matter what, stage you're at. But for fat loss, pro-metabolic. Okay, so pro-metabolic fat loss is going to increase or, not hurt your thyroid. Your T4 to T3 conversion, all of that is really important. All of this will be destroyed if you start doing fasting or you start doing carnivore or anything like that. You don't want to do that. But the way you get pro-metabolic fat loss is you maximize your thyroid. Okay, so the way you do that is, first of all, avoid polyunsaturated fat. Eat lots of carbs, clean carbs from fruit juice, honey. Keep your protein moderate. Not too much fat, right? And you sleep. Obviously, you don't exercise too much. All right, if you minimize stress hormones, so you don't exercise, you don't fast. You wake up in the morning and you eat breakfast. Okay, all of these things I could make 100 videos on how to maximize your thyroid. There's so much information to cover. But when you do that, when you maybe follow some of the other advice I've given you in other videos, then you use all your food for energy. Like, you don't realize that when, like, people say, oh, calories in, calories out. The calories in to the calories out is a very hard thing to measure because a lot of people just don't account for this middle arrow right here. Like, what is this middle arrow? How big is this arrow? Can you convert all of the food you're eating into fuel, into ATP? This is really ATP, okay? Because if this arrow is small, then you can eat, let's say you're eating 2,000 calories. A lot of those calories are going to be turned into fat instead of being turned into ATP. If this arrow is small, if your thyroid is not functioning properly. But if your arrow is large, if your arrow is very large, then you can put these 2,000 calories in and produce all of it as ATP. You see what I mean? Like, you're putting more gasoline into the car and the car's just using it up, just gobbling it up, right? Whereas if you're sabotaging your thyroid by fasting or doing carnivore, you might have an increased level of fat loss. Like, you might have, up here in terms of fat loss instead of like down here. But you're also going to store more fat because you're going to be slowing down your thyroid. And so more of the food you eat is going to be turning into fat. And so then you have to do all these extreme things where you fast for 24 hours instead of 16. And then you do 0 carbs ever. And then it's just basically a downward spiral because you're going to keep storing fat but also keep burning fat. Whereas if you maximize your thyroid, you turn all of the food you eat into ATP. So you use all food for energy. So you're not storing any fat. You're storing basically 0 fat. Then what happens is that your baseline lipolysis, which is like carnivore is going to get you like up here in terms of lipolysis, but your baseline is already down here without doing any carnivore, with eating plenty of food, eating in the morning, no fasting. Your baseline lipolysis is right there. That's going to create pretty steady weight loss, like permanently, as long as you keep your engine running and you don't store anything as fat. Like, there's this balance between what you're burning at baseline and what you're storing. Because if what you're storing is higher, it probably is right now. You're probably storing more fat than you're burning at baseline. Then you're gonna gain weight. You're gonna gain body fat. But if you can maximize your thyroid and just let this baseline lipolysis do its job, it's gonna burn fat for you steadily. It's not gonna be the quickest thing in the world, like a carnivore diet or a fasting, routine will. It's not going to burn fat that quickly, but it's going to basically give you steady fat loss, and you're going to feel fantastic because your thyroid's going to be maximized, and your testosterone is going to be fantastic as well because you're not cutting calories, putting your body in starvation mode, cutting carbs, restricting eating windows. No, your baseline lipolysis will create fat loss. That is pro-metabolic fat loss. It works so well, okay? So I just wanted to give you that. Also, avoid polyunsaturated fat at all costs because this is the number one thing that's going to slow down your thyroid, along with any of the starvation stuff like carnivore or fasting or anything. So, that said, also for testosterone, your testosterone is going to be much higher if you avoid polyunsaturated fat. And all of your fat intake, if you're doing 20% or 30 or 40, all of it should come from SFA and some monounsaturated fats. And you just have to lock in, avoid the restaurants that cook in seed oils, avoid all of the, bacon. Conventionally raised pork has a lot of polyunsaturated fat. Conventionally raised chicken, so like chicken thighs, anything like that is going to hurt your thyroid. Anything with polyunsaturated fat. Stop going to Chipotle, okay? You just have to lock in, and you will basically have high testosterone. It's that simple.